I wasn't very nervous, but now I'm up here, I feel a bit differently. So, when Stephen first floated the idea of me doing a Why I'm a Christian talk, my first thought was, oh no, I haven't lived, I'm far too young. I wasn't sure, and I'm still not sure, if my life experience with God was worth talking about or interesting enough for people to want to listen to. In fact, a flurry of people from this very congregation have informed me they would be away on holiday during my talk. So I could be led to believe that that's the truth. That said, looking back on my life and my relationship with God, I hope there are parts of my story that resonate with you, or at least those of you who are here today. I'll start from the beginning. I was born in London in September 1992 and grew up in Vauxhall with my parents, brother and sisters. On the left is quite a recent, silly photo of us all. And on the right, you can see a younger version of me in a very 90s outfit. Dungarees, pink sleeves, fancy hairbands. It seems that almost all parents with children born in the 90s would thought it was fun to trust their children in questionable outfits. My mum and dad moved to London from Sierra Leone in the late 1980s. Sierra Leone is a small country in West Africa, which some of you may know from some of the disasters that have struck in recent memory, such as the brutal 11-year civil war ending in 2002, or the deadly Ebola outbreak in 2014. But to me, I hold it dear to my heart as my ancestral home. My memories from visits there are filled with fondness, family, fresh food, and beautiful, beautiful beaches. As well as having some of the world's most beautiful landscapes, Sierra Leone has lots of religious diversity, with many practicing Islam, Christianity, and other traditional faiths. My own experience of seeing this firsthand comes from my granddad's house in Murray Town, where you can hear Islamic calls to prayer on one side of the house and church bells ringing on the other. Though a country with a majority Muslim population, my family is Christian, and growing up, I had the privilege to know two of my grandparents. My paternal grandfather was a local preacher, and my maternal grandmother was a long-serving Sunday school teacher for over 40 years. Faith has always been a significant part of my family life. My first encounter with faith was very young. On the left, you can see a photo of me on the day of my christening. And whilst I'm clearly too young to remember the specifics of the day, and I definitely can't tell you what was going through my mind when this photo was taken, what I do remember of my early childhood is my little book of everyday prayers. When I was 5, my mum and dad told me I was soon going to have a new baby in the family. I remember praying every day as hard as I could for a little brother. I already had sisters, and I wanted a brother most in the world. So who else to turn to but God? Every night I would read from my book and pray my mum would have a little boy. When my prayers were answered, I knew God could do anything. That was the first time I felt God heard me. So, imagine my disappointment when my brother arrives and he's exactly what I asked for, an annoying little brother. But still, my first love and someone who I cherish. My family and I went to church in Bermondsey when I was young, but I always wished we would go to the church attached to my primary school where all my friends went. I loved school. St. Mark's was a Church of England school where we would pray during assembly, sing songs of celebration, and had the most committed and creative music teachers for the Christmas show. The vicar would come and speak to us and teach us to love one another as God commanded. Faith was very much a part of our everyday vocabulary. Going to a church school was a great way to help me build my faith at a young age, even if it meant that I was embarrassed when Louis Naquo, who you'll see on the top row of boys on the right, was asked if he had a crush on me. And he said, "I love her in God's way and in my own way." Then, when I was 10 years old, we left London and came to live in West Molesey in Surrey. A new house, a new town, and a new school. I was suddenly in a new area where I didn't know anyone, and we were the only black family in a predominantly white secular school. Everything was different. Well, there were some things that were familiar at this school. We sang songs in assembly, we practiced our times tables, and I still loved school. However, we didn't pray or speak about God. My new school friends didn't go to church on Sunday. They played football or went swimming instead. Jesus wasn't cool. Church wasn't the done thing. Before we'd moved, I'd been quite a shy child with only a few close friends. But being thrust into this strange environment, I soon felt I had to adapt. So I didn't talk about my faith to my friends. I wanted to fit in. Instead, me and my family went to church in East Molesey Methodist Church. And I made friends with the young people there. It was a small church, and even smaller these days, but that's where I grew my faith, where a small group of people shared a common belief. It was here that I had my confirmation alongside my younger brother and sister, and with my own mind chose to commit myself to God. Though on reflection, somewhat quietly, I felt like I'd had this experience, this huge change, but outside of my church friends, I had no one to share that with. Soon after, I went to study French with international relations at Royal Holloway in Egham, my first time living away from my family. Granted, only about 11 miles away, but away nonetheless. Just like at age 10, I found myself in a new town, at a new school, with a new set of friends to get to know. I wanted to fit in. I wanted to find a community. I wanted to do well with my grades, but I also needed to pay my way. I had a part-time job working at Waitrose on Saturdays and Sundays to help supplement my student loan income. This meant I didn't have the time that I wanted to go to church. And since my family had moved and didn't regularly go to church in Molesey anymore, I wasn't sure where my church home was. Like many at that age, I felt that I had 101 demands and priorities, and every decision felt like whatever I did would dictate the rest of my life, whether that was studying, procrastinating, romantic relationships, work experience, going on a night out, clubbing in Windsor, volunteering, procrastinating some more, developing new friendships, or maintaining old ones. I enjoyed my first 2 years at uni, but I found that my faith had waned. During this time, my grandpa had died, I experienced my first heartbreak, and at one point my car failed its MOT and I barely had the money to replace it. I didn't know where God was at this point in my life, and if I'm honest, I felt like I didn't have the time to seek him out. In the third year of my degree, I went on my year abroad to live and work in Paris. I was armed with lofty ideas of strolling on the Champs-Élysées, taking selfies by the Eiffel Tower, and most importantly, finding a handsome French man to bring back to my family, or maybe never come back at all. I was hit with the stark reality that you can't just run away to Paris and expect life to be full of idyllic bliss, just like in the critically acclaimed French film Amélie that I'd avidly studied. The city was beautiful, as the Olympics this past week has shown us, but it was easy to feel lonely, and the first few weeks that was my overwhelming feeling. I was assigned by the British Council to work in a school teaching English to children. Once again, I found myself in a new place, in a new school, and more than ever desperate to make some new friends to spend the year with. The first day of training, I arrived at the top of the metro station and found a group of English-speaking women holding British Council training booklets. I asked if they were going to training and if I could sit with them. After a full day of sitting in an auditorium, learning about the curriculum and how to keep children engaged with English games, we decided to go for an early dinner to stay connected and keep in touch. One of the women, Katie, shared how she'd been missing home, but was looking forward to going to church on Sunday. The thought of going to church in France seemed far too complex to me. Would I be expected to know the Lord's Prayer in French? But Katie told me that it was an international church with a large expat community. Hillsong was exactly what I needed. I went along on Sundays where the services were in English with a French translator. I learned the French worship songs. I joined in the strange concept of raving at church, but avoiding what can only be described as a mosh pit at the very front. I joined a home group for the first time and connected with people who were really on fire for Christ in a way that I hadn't seen before. However, whilst I can tell you that the words on the screen there say, "He is risen," I still don't know the Lord's Prayer in French, so please don't ask me. It was wonderful to draw closer to God again and to be surrounded by people just like me who felt the same. I would love to say it's a city of love and every moment was a dream, but in reality it was quite challenging. At school, I was not a trained teacher, and the children could sense that, so they pushed my buttons a bit. At lunch, I wanted to practice my French, so I would force myself to sit in the staff room with the other teachers during the 2-hour lunch break, but would always be just a little bit too slow to contribute when keeping up with their rapid conversation. But awkwardness and pushing myself out of my comfort zone were things I knew I would have to do. What I didn't expect was to be attacked on my way home during one December evening. I'd been to do some food shopping. I got off the bus and took my usual route down the steps to the house I shared with 3 other people. A young man, no older than 17 or 18, was walking in the opposite direction towards me. He passed me, but then turned back and pushed me to the floor. I was terrified. I'd remembered that growing up, my mum had always told us to scream if we were ever in danger, and I've got a decent pair of lungs on me. So I did. The man was clearly alarmed by my cries and ran away. The attack itself must have only lasted a few seconds, and other than a cut on my finger, I was physically unhurt. I made my way back to my house where my kind roommate let me in, let me cry on his shoulder as I tried to explain what had happened to me. He gave me a plaster, made me a warm drink, and rescued my sliced ham, which had been left behind in the shop. That night, after I'd cried on the phone to my parents, I went to bed thinking, why did God let that happen to me? Especially when I had been growing my faith again. It didn't feel fair. I went home for Christmas, feeling happy to be back with my family. Whilst I was nervous about going back to France in the new year, I was also emboldened. Growing my faith had allowed me the spiritual knowledge and strength to move forward from the attack, and those readings I chose before my talk reflect that. Psalm 23 especially. Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for you are with me. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. I'd had a really horrible experience, but I knew that this was not how God designed the earth to be. I still felt God by my side. He didn't create this world for us to suffer. He wants us to experience joy, but sin can infiltrate our lives and disrupt his plan. But I knew his plan for me was even greater than I could imagine, and I would call upon that knowledge throughout the rest of my time abroad. So, after my year in Paris, I returned to the UK to finish my degree. I went back to working part-time at Waitrose and spent my lunch breaks talking to a nice young man who was my counsel and cheerleader whilst I wrote my dissertation. This is one of our first photos together in our uniforms. He's just there at the front, by the way. Even though we'd met 4 years earlier when I first started working there, it was only at this time that Peter and I grew closer, and I began to think, wow, he's really hit the jackpot with me. After I'd graduated, I began to tire of customers getting irrationally angry because we'd run out of a particular jar of artichoke. And I wanted to work somewhere where I could make a difference in the world. I started working at VSO, Voluntary Service Overseas, based in Kingston, in the customer care team. Whilst my role was focused on administration and fundraising, I was part of an organisation helping to reduce poverty and improve health outcomes in some of the world's most marginalised communities, including my beloved Sierra Leone. Then, Peter and I decided to move in together and lived in Putney. Our flat was tiny. We only had one radiator, and at one point we even had mice. But I loved building a life together. Here's a photo of us with our first Christmas tree. I was in a new town, in a new home, but I knew we weren't going to stay there forever. So whilst I kept my faith and my relationship with God, I didn't seek out a church to belong to. We stayed in Putney for almost 3 years, then decided if we were ever going to buy a property of our own, then we'd need to get serious about saving. So, like any good millennials, we planned to move in with our respective parents in March 2020. The first lockdown was announced 3 days before our planned move date. I remember watching Boris Johnson on the TV and wondering if I could move our van higher to the morning and furiously packing boxes. As I was with my family in Walton-on-Thames and Peter was with his in Barnes, we were apart for months, and it was a difficult time personally and globally. Peter was still required to work. Meanwhile, I had just started to work for the charity Breast Cancer Now and was furloughed. I missed Peter. I felt guilty about being free to lounge around in the glorious weather we had that year, but also quite concerned for my job security. I was in a familiar town, in my old home, but I couldn't see my friends or partner. But my relationship with God was still there. And my mum and my sister Nicola, together, we turned to him through the big screen. Nicola was a regular church member of a church in Epsom before the pandemic. And like many churches, they switched their services online. So we would watch, worship, and pray together in our living room. I had missed praying with others in the presence of God. By moving back in with parents, Peter and I had saved enough money to buy a flat in 2021 during the third lockdown, and New Malden seemed like the perfect location. We would still be close to our families, but able to live somewhere together again and call it our own. So, you know the drill by now, new home, new town, and in the midst of a global pandemic that had taken us so far from community, I knew I wanted to find a home in a local church. However, the restrictions at this time limited my options, and as we began to navigate the new normal and the various rules that came with it, I'd forgotten what I'd set out to do. Then in late 2021, my dear cousin Chelsea caught COVID. She was 17 and put on a ventilator. When I heard the news, it was surreal. So far, I'd been quite lucky, as no one in my close circle had been affected, although I know, of course, many people tragically lost their loved ones too soon. I never dreamt it would happen to me. Especially by this point, the vaccine was available and Chelsea was just too young. I say it was surreal because whilst it was a scary situation, I wasn't afraid. Just like when I was 5 years old, I knew God would answer my prayer. I'd asked God to heal her by the end of the week. She was on a ventilator for just 2 days. He really does work miracles. That Sunday, I found myself at the 11 a.m. service at Christ Church. I was so grateful. I needed to be in the presence of the Lord with others. The vicar introduced himself to me. I thought he was larger than life. Peter thought he was too good to be true. My first service here at Christ Church brought back a sense of peace that I was longing for, but I didn't want to make any rash decisions. I wanted to be somewhere where I could continue to grow my faith. I did a church search and visited a few in New Malden to see where felt right. Then we went away on holiday, and after Peter proposed in July 2022, I thought again of Christ Church, where I'd felt that sense of peace a few months back. I knew that was where I wanted to get married. When we returned, it was the start of that year's Why I Am a Christian talks. I remember crying every week and thinking, I do like this church, but I must stop crying. I reintroduced myself to Stephen and threw myself into church life. I was energized by the children's song at the 9:30 service, welcomed by so many people in the lounge. I volunteered to serve tea and coffee. I I took part in the Bible study group Making Sense of Paul, which exercised my scholarly brain cells, which had become somewhat dormant. I embraced my heritage and brought some jollof rice to the bring and share we had to celebrate the coronation. I volunteered myself and Peter to help treat the church floors. I'd found the church home that I'd been looking for. Peter and I got married here at Christ Church in August 2023. Almost a year ago now, we committed ourselves in front of our friends and our family to each other in front of God. Some of the guests who attended are some of my friends who I'd previously kept separated from my faith, and it has been so wonderful to show them the full extent of my love for God and how much being close to God is important to me and brings me joy. So, it turns out I'm not so young. I have lived, but have I answered the question, why am I a Christian? My life experience has shown me that God will always be there for me. Even if my faith wanes, I know there is a constant I can always return to who wants and does provide the best for me. I don't have to have had a big scary life event. I don't have to have had a great epiphany. I just need to know he sent his Son to die for our sins so that we can have everlasting life. Every day I choose to be a Christian, some days more than others. But I gave my life to God and my fate is in his hands. When I look ahead to the rest of my life, I see him there with me. And when I think of the next phase of my life, I see it here at Christ Church with a family of my own, God by my side, and still enthusiastically participating in the children's song at Stephen's request, of course. So I want to end my talk today with a prayer from my little book of everyday prayers that fed my faith so much when I was young. A prayer that reminds me to keep that faith because of all the good God's done and brought into my life so far and what he will continue to do. Thank you for the world so sweet. Thank you for the food we eat. Thank you for the birds that sing. Thank you, God, for everything. Amen.